wonderful experience of 2 trips to the Middle East. The first was to Egypt, and the second was to Israel. And the trip to Israel had been planned for a long time and delayed because of COVID. But then the trip to Egypt came up on Facebook from a friend in the Peace Corps, and I thought, boy, these are awfully close together to be traveling kind of to the same place, but I'm going to go to Egypt, like the children of Israel, and then go to the Holy Land. And it just seemed like there was some godivity in it, so off our set. So Egypt was in February, and the Holy Land was in March. But as we read from this scripture in Genesis, this was the path of the early Christian children of Israel. They were led by Jacob, who God gave the name Israel, and that's why we talk about the children of Israel. They went down from where they were living in Canaan to Egypt, and this was over 1,000 years before Jesus was born. So they think it was more like 1,500 years before Jesus was born when they went down into Egypt. In our Swedenborg tradition, Egypt means remains. Those good, kind, and true lessons that we learned as children. Many of you here probably had Vivian for your Sunday school teacher, or others. Who else did the Sunday school teaching here? Anita. Did Marion, or did she do mostly adult? I don't think. And in Prairie, we had Jean Graber that did a lot of the Sunday school teaching. Did you do some too, Linda? Yes, a lot. And Vanita? I know Eric did a lot of the teaching too. So those remains are the part in us that are lessons that we learned as children. And we talked today in the Sunday school downstairs about what about the people that didn't have a good upbringing? What do they have? And they can receive these remains from different ways, from other people that are kind to them, from school teachers, from just a variety of ways. But it's that innocence, it's called the innocence of infancy. So that's what Egypt represents, that's woven inside of all of us. I like to think of it as the spark of the divine, the spark of God that is within us all. So the children of Israel went down to Egypt because, as I said, a famine in their land, and they were hungry. And Joseph and Mary went down to Egypt to protect the life of their baby Jesus from the jealous King Herod. But we can all go down into Egypt spiritually at those times when we're feeling hungry for the Lord, hungry for something more in our life, looking to God's guidance. And also those times when we're afraid or we feel we need protection. We can go back to those beautiful stories of the Bible and the stories of Jesus. To tell you the truth, I went to Egypt because I was curious. I had heard so much about Egypt and I just wanted to go down and see what I found there and hadn't really thought about it being a religious experience. But for me, it was a religious experience, and that's one of the things I want to share with you today. We climbed down into tombs, we went under pyramids, we went into temples, and we found everywhere what's on the front of your bulletin, hieroglyphics. They are written in a language that the Egyptians, thousands of years ago, used. They are what's called a pictorial representation of objects that connect to a higher spiritual value. So these hieroglyphics would tell stories in the tombs about the people that were buried there, or tell stories that people would look at. And for a long time, they couldn't figure out what they meant. But then they found what was called the Rosetta Stone in the late 1800s. And it had the hieroglyphics, and then it had in the language of the Egyptians the meaning of it, and also in the Latin meaning of it. So they were able to understand a little bit of what these are. A picture of a hand meant a hand, but it also meant power, or protection. So you would see the hand in front of the doors often as protection. A musical instrument meant joy and gladness. And birds represent spiritual ideas that can flit through our minds, and we need to look and watch deeply so we can get the meaning that the Lord is bringing to us. These symbols were what related very closely to what Swedenborg called the language of correspondences. And he said in his writings, and this was even before the Rosetta Stone or anything was found about that there was a language common to all cultures, ancient, and sometimes they called the ancient churches. We hear him speak often about ancient churches, which just meant the ancient people and what they believed. And at one time, the language of correspondences was known to all these ancient churches. So not only in Egypt, but those that have had the opportunity to visit in Central America, the Mayan culture and the things that they did there, this language of correspondences was available to all of them. It was kind of a mystical knowledge that describes how the physical energy manifests itself in nature. And it connected the spiritual and the natural. In ancient times, people perceived that every created thing is linked with creation's purpose and design, and therefore can represent a quality of God. The sun, for Egyptians, was very important, and it represented by a god with a solar disk above his head, with extending rays. And that's why they built the pyramids in the size that they did, in the form that they did, because they saw that as the sun and the rays coming down to the people. And they also built these pyramids because they were trying to find their way to God, to an understanding of God, and trying to get high. And I was reminded of the Tower of Babel in our scripture, and how people were trying to build a ladder, a way up to find God. And then all their languages were confounded. Well, what happened in the most ancient church, and these churches that had correspondences and this connection with the divine, it was lost. Swedenborg wrote, "The Egyptians were in possession of religious representatives and symbolic signs. Their hieroglyphics served to donate spiritual realities, and people knew that they did, in actual fact, correspond to these realities." So that was really this truth. And he explained that the Egyptians didn't worship the physical sun, but the divine sun, the source of all life. And our Egyptian guide said the same thing when I asked him about that. He said that ancient peoples did not worship the animals, because it looked like a lot of times the gods were connected with animals. They would have cobras on their heads or the faces of different animals. But they worshiped the power symbols that they represented. So kind of like they worshiped the God within. This was really helpful for me so I could get this different idea about the correspondences and how important they are. Because every once in a while when we're studying the Bible, we'll try to understand the correspondences that are there. And this takes us back to this inner knowledge that was available to everyone. But Swedenborg went on to say that eventually the knowledge of correspondences became corrupted and was misused as black magic. People moved to worship the symbols themselves instead of that higher purpose and that higher spirit that they originally represented. So I want to pass out, I've got some pictures for you because I couldn't show pictures today. And Jean, could you help me with this? We're going to have to share some of these, so every couple people that can share. I want to tell you a story about one that I found was really fascinating. And I thought, I'm glad to see Zach here. I think you could even relate to this. Do you know what a dung beetle is? Did you study that in school at all? I'm not sure what they're called now. But there were dung beetles in Egyptian times. And a dung beetle was just, situated here so I don't lose it. We have dung beetles in the prairie around us now. Maybe some of you have heard of them. But they would roll the dung into a ball, And then they would bury it underground and lay their eggs in it. And then the dung beetle they themselves would actually die, and the babies would be born, and they could eat this dung to get them going in life. So the left picture there are the hieroglyphics as they were colored in. The middle picture is what's called a scarab, or an amulet of a dung beetle. And what they figured out, or what made sense to them, was that this was an example of renewal and rebirth. Because they were always worried about what's going to happen, as we all are, what's going to happen after I die. Well, they looked at what happened to the dung beetles, and they thought, oh, you go underground, get buried, and then you come back to life, because then the little baby dung beetles would all come out of the ground. So they didn't really worship the dung beetle, but they thought it had great power. So when you died, you were buried with an amulet, with one of these little representations of a dung beetle with you to protect you. And then the next page, or the next picture there, is also the hieroglyphics, and you can see the dung beetle right in that picture. So I thought that was just fascinating how they were trying to understand, the Egyptians were trying to understand the things that they couldn't understand with their scientific minds that they had in the time. And they were trying to understand to the best that they could. So they created gods, a variety of gods. There was a god for the sun, a god for the moon, a god for the night, a god for the day, a god for floods, a god for rain. All these different gods as they were trying to understand the one ultimate God. But I found myself wondering, where is God in the midst of this? Where's the one God that we all worship and represent? And I had kind of an aha experience, because I realized the Egyptians were just trying to connect with God in the way we all are trying to connect with God. And at that time, the way that they did it was to have a variety. And eventually, after Jesus was born, the whole country turned to Christianity. And it was a Christian nation for a while. Now, there's a variety of different religions that are back in that area. And we even had, our guide was what was called a Coptic Christian. Coptic just means Egyptian Christian. So he took us to his church, and we went in this beautiful ornate church, and down in it was built over a cave, and they believed that was the cave that Jesus was taken to by Joseph and Mary, and where he was saved in Egypt. So they believed that was the cave that they hid in to protect them from Herod. And I had never thought about, well, where did they go in Egypt, or what did they do? And yet here was this church that was holding that. And then the other thing that happened, and this is related to the second row of pictures, on the walls of the tombs and everything, there were a lot of what are called pictographs. And the way they did this, if they were stone, but then they put like a plaster on it, and that's how they did the hieroglyphics too, is they etched them into the plaster. It wasn't like they were actually trying to etch them into the limestone. But and then they would color them, as you've seen there. But there were also these pictographs, which, when it was a tomb or a temple for a certain god, it would show these battles that they had tried to overcome. And this one on the right side kept showing up over and over again, where these people were carrying like a boat that had a big box on top of it. And I was thinking about from Exodus 25, let me read to you, where the Lord said to Moses, have them make an ark out of wood, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. Overlay it with pure gold, pure inside and out, make gold molding around it, cast 4 gold rings for it, and fasten it to its feet with 2 rings on one side and on the other. And it was so exact. And then his directions were that they were to put the tablets of the covenant law, which he was going to give them, the 10 commandments, in this box. And that's what the children of Israel carried around as they were trying to find their way back to the Holy Land. And I thought, but God said this to Moses. So how did we have this same image in these tombs that were thousands and thousands of years before the children of Israel came down into Egypt? How did they have the same instructions? Because I asked our guide, I said, do you have acacia wood around here? And he says, oh yeah, it was acacia wood that they were supposed to use to create this ark. And then they overlaid it with gold. And on the bottom is the picture from one of the museums of what they thought these arks were like when they built them. And I don't know if you can look close enough, but on the middle of that are two gods with their wings unfurled, protecting it, just like Moses was instructed to do on the Ark of the Covenant. This is from my NIV Bible on the right-hand side, the Ark of the Covenant. The instructions were so exact, and yet these children, these people from Egypt, had made a similar ark to carry their gods around in and to worship in. And it just, I don't know, it just all of a sudden dawned on me that why would I think that God only spoke to the children of Israel? Why would I not think that God was also instructing the Egyptians, the Mayans, all these other people in ancient cultures that were trying to find their way to God? God was always there too. So to me, it just reinforced that what they were told to do was similar to what the children of Israel were told to do in creating this ark, which we call the Ark of the Covenant. In our bulletin, this is the last thing I wanted to talk about, on the back, the Swedenborg Heavenly Secrets. Swedenborg explains what went wrong and why they lost this image, why they lost this language of correspondences, which helped them connect with the divine. The doctrine of charity was the doctrine in the ancient churches. This doctrine conjoined all the churches, so they were all conjoined by the doctrine of charity. And charity has changed its meaning now. Sometimes we think of it as giving money or taking care of the needy. But charity in this era that Swedenborg was writing is really the doctrine of taking care of your neighbor. It's the doctrine of neighborly love, of caring for one another. So when they lost this doctrine, that was what was conjoining the churches and making them all one. It made one out of the many. For they acknowledged as people of the church all who lived in the good of charity and called them brethren, however greatly they might be at variance in the truths, which at this day are called the truths of faith. In these one instructed another. So they were talking together about what they believed. There wasn't this division. They were talking together. And it didn't matter whether they agreed with the opinion of another, knowing that everyone receives truth in the proportion as he is in good. So everybody has a bit of the truth. And it was when they all would come together that they could be in truth and they could be one church. And I thought, wow, that's really what we need now. If we live that doctrine of charity, however much we may be at variance with what somebody else believes is truth, we're not indignant if they don't believe the same or agree the same way that we do. Because we know that God comes to everyone in the way they can receive God and brings truth. So they all have the truth as they could understand it. And it didn't mean that God left them when this doctrine of charity kind of fell apart, because God does not turn away from anyone when we're trying to understand the infinite and sometimes falling short. It took centuries for God coming to earth as one of us, as Jesus. And that's when many Egyptians turned to Christianity. And then there's one more connecting story that happened in the last days when we visited the Holy Land, and that's on the back side. In the Holy Land, we visited these ornate churches that were always built on top of where they thought something significant had happened. So there was a church where they think that Jesus worked as a carpenter. There was a church, the one in the middle there is the Church of the Beatitudes, which was beautiful. And we visited all these churches, and I realized that I felt personally closest to God when I was out on the boat on the Sea of Galilee, which is the picture there in the middle. And when I looked at the sunset over Capernaum and the different stories, the different villages that Jesus went to as he worshiped, more than I felt connected when I went into these ornate churches that they thought might be over a place where Jesus had been. And once again, I'm kind of, well, where is God in all of this? Is God in these fancy churches or God out here on the Sea of Galilee? And I went into, the last church we went into was the Church of the Annunciation. And the Church of the Annunciation is where Jesus received, or where Mary received the angel Gabriel that came and told her that she was going to have a baby, God's son. That's the Church of the Annunciation. And so it was run by the Catholic Church, and there was an upper area, like a balcony, that we could stand around, and the priests were down here with their big white robes and their crosses and the incense, and they were worshiping. And I noticed the people around the outside were, a lot of them were in tears, they were praying, they were just so, it seemed so close to God in this place. And I didn't feel it. I thought, why don't I feel this connection with God in this place? God, where are you? Is what I asked. And I was in prayer kind of standing back and listening to all these different languages of people praying and listening to the priests in their Latin. And that's when this picture on the right-hand side, I opened my eyes, and on the floor, I saw this beautiful blue light. And my photo does not do it justice, because to me, it looked like a beautiful blue dove dancing around. And to me, it was God saying, I am right here, Jane. People find me in different ways. Just because you may not find me within the Catholic tradition doesn't mean I'm not in the very midst of us. I am with everyone in the way that they can understand. I am with the Buddhist and the Hindu and the Muslim and the Christians, and you, and the folk at Prairie, and the folk at Pawnee Rock, in the way that you can understand. So don't judge one way right and one way wrong. Just look for me wherever you are.